I used to believe the most dangerous thing a person could do at a wedding was say the wrong name. Until Mason Clark reached into the inside pocket of his ivory suit jacket and pulled out the letter I had written when I was 17, the letter I had never meant for him to read, the letter that had spent 10 years surviving in some quiet corner of his life, while I tried to pretend I had survived without it. The glass greenhouse around us glowed with late afternoon light, soft and golden, the kind of light that made everything look kinder than it had any right to be. Outside, the last snow of March was melting along the edge of Lake Briar, dripping from the bare maple branches in slow silver threads. Inside, white tulips leaned toward the aisle, candles flickered in little hurricane jars, and 50 people sat perfectly still, as if the whole room had forgotten how to breathe. Mason stood at the front beneath an arch he had built with his own hands from reclaimed oak, because of course he had. Mason had always been the kind of man who could fix a broken railing, a stubborn engine, a cracked kitchen tile, and make it seem like the world was not falling apart, but merely waiting for the right hands. He was 29 now, broader in the shoulders than the boy I remembered, his sandy blonde hair neatly combed for once, though one piece had already escaped above his left eyebrow. I noticed that piece immediately. I hated that I noticed it. I hated that after 10 years, after missed birthdays and careful phone calls and pretending my heart had become a reasonable adult, one loose strand of his hair could still undo me. I was standing only 8 feet away, close enough to see the tremor in his thumb as he unfolded the paper. The envelope was faded blue, the corners softened, my teenage handwriting still pressed across the front in ink that had once been navy and was now nearly gray. For Mason, when I'm brave enough. A quiet, nervous laugh moved through the guests, because they thought this was charming. They thought this was part of the vows. They thought the man in the tailored suit was about to read some sweet old memory from high school, maybe something funny about prom or baseball practice, or the night we accidentally set off the smoke alarm trying to bake brownies in his mother's kitchen. They did not know that my knees had gone weak. They did not know that every version of me I had buried was suddenly standing in that greenhouse too, 17 and terrified, 22 and lonely, 27 and still pretending I was only happy for him. Mason looked up from the letter, and his eyes found mine. Not the crowd. Not Clara, who stood near the first row with her wedding planner clipboard held against her chest like a secret she had been trusted to protect. Me. Just me. His voice, when he spoke, was low and unsteady, but warm enough to break something open. 10 years ago, someone wrote me a letter and never meant for me to read it. I kept it anyway. My breath caught. The lake behind the glass flashed gold. Mason swallowed, his smile small and impossibly gentle. I kept it because some part of me knew that when I was finally brave enough to open it, my life would have to change. And as he looked at me in front of everyone, holding the oldest piece of my heart between his hands, I understood with a sudden, impossible clarity that this was not the ending I had feared for 10 years. This was the moment the story finally began. Before that greenhouse, before the tulips and the candles and Mason standing in front of everyone with my letter in his hands, there was a summer when we were 17 and the whole world seemed to fit inside a small Vermont town with one grocery store, one movie theater, and a public library that smelled like dust, paper, and rain. Mason Clark came into my life on a Tuesday afternoon in June, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a lemonade from Daisy's Diner in the other, looking like he had been built by sunlight and bad decisions. I was sitting behind the library, sketching the crooked old oak tree that leaned over the bike rack, because I had convinced myself that if I drew it enough times, I might understand why it looked lonely instead of just old. Mason walked past me, stopped, took 3 steps back, and said, "That branch looks like it is trying to escape." I remember staring at him, because nobody had ever looked at one of my drawings and understood the feeling before the shape. He was the kind of boy everyone already knew. Baseball team, easy smile, grass stains on his jeans, teachers calling him dependable as if it were his official job title. I was the quiet kid with ink on my fingers, a scholarship brochure folded in my backpack, and a nervous habit of laughing before anyone could decide I was strange. We should not have become best friends. He spent his weekends helping his dad repair porch steps around town, and I spent mine drawing fantasy maps for stories I never finished. He liked country radio and terrible gas station hot dogs. I liked old movie soundtracks and cinnamon rolls from the bakery that always gave me stomachaches. But Mason had a way of showing up beside people as if the space had been waiting for him. The first week, he asked if he could see my sketchbook. The second week, he brought me a mechanical pencil because he noticed mine kept breaking. By July, we were building a tree house behind the library with scrap what his father said would otherwise rot in their garage. It was not much of a tree house, really. It was a platform 6 feet off the ground with crooked railings, a patched roof, and a milk crate full of comic books we swore were classics. To me, it was a palace. Mason called it headquarters. Every evening after dinner, he would climb up first, then reach down to pull me after him, even though I always said I could manage. We drank warm soda, listened to cicadas, and talked about everything except the things that mattered most. He told me he wanted to restore old houses because tearing them down felt too easy. I told him I wanted to draw books for children who felt safer in imaginary places. He said that sounded important. Not cute, not weird, not unrealistic. Important. That was Mason's gift. He made my smallest dreams stand up straighter. Sometimes, when the sun dropped behind the lake and painted his hair copper, he would go quiet in a way that made my chest ache. I would pretend to study the clouds while secretly memorizing the line of his profile, the scratch on his knuckle, the soft concentration in his face when he carved our initials under the railing with his pocket knife. MC and NB, uneven and permanent. He grinned when he finished and said, "Now nobody can evict us." I laughed because it was easier than admitting how badly I wanted that to be true. At 17, I did not have the courage to call it love. I only knew that when Mason saved me the last slice of pizza, when he walked his bike beside mine because I hated riding downhill, when he said my name like it was something he was happy to find in a room, the world became less sharp around the edges. And for one golden summer, I let myself believe that being his best friend might be enough. The storm arrived on the last Friday of August, the kind of summer storm that made the whole town smell like wet pavement, cut grass, and electricity. By 6 o'clock, the lights in the library flickered twice. The librarian announced that everyone should head home, and Mason looked at me with the grin of a boy who believed bad weather was just an invitation wearing thunder. We ended up in headquarters with 2 flashlights, a bag of pretzels, and the old blue quilt his mother kept in the back of his truck for baseball games. Rain tapped against the patched roof in 100 uneven rhythms, slipping through one corner where Mason had promised he would fix the leak 3 weeks earlier. He sat beneath it with a plastic cup in his hand, catching the drops like a proud inventor, and I laughed so hard my stomach hurt. That was the problem with Mason. Even when my heart was trying to protect itself, he could still make joy feel accidental and easy. The tree swayed beneath us, not enough to be dangerous, just enough to make the world outside feel far away. The library windows were dark. The baseball field across the street was empty. For once, there was no one calling his name, no one asking me why I was so quiet, no future pressing its face against the glass. There was only Mason, 6 feet away and somehow too close, his damp hair curling at the ends, his sleeves pushed up, a flashlight balanced under his chin as he told a ridiculous ghost story about a librarian who haunted overdue romance novels. I threw a pretzel at him. He missed catching it and bowed like he had meant to fail. Then, after a long, comfortable silence, he said he was thinking about asking Emily Parker to the fall dance. The sentence was small, ordinary. It should not have changed the air. Emily was nice, with shiny brown hair and a laugh that carried across the cafeteria like bells. She volunteered at the animal shelter. She always remembered people's birthdays. She was exactly the kind of girl someone like Mason should ask to a dance. I said, "You should. She will probably say yes." My voice sounded normal, which felt like a magic trick and a betrayal at the same time. Mason looked relieved, and that hurt more than if he had looked uncertain. He bumped his shoulder against mine and said, "You think so? I am terrible at that stuff." I wanted to say that he was not terrible at being loved. He was terrible at noticing it. Instead, I smiled and told him not to bring flowers from the gas station unless he wanted Emily to think romance came with a 2-for-1 soda coupon. He laughed, bright and open, and the storm swallowed the sound before I could keep it. Later, when my mother picked me up because the roads were flooding near the lake, Mason stood under the oak tree waving both flashlights like airport signals. I watched him shrink through the rain-streaked back window of the car, and felt something inside me settle into a shape I could no longer pretend was friendship. That night, the power stayed out until almost midnight. I sat at my desk with a candle in an old jam jar, my sketchbook open but untouched. My room was humid, my sneakers were still damp, and my heart felt too large for my chest. I took out 3 sheets of notebook paper and began writing before courage had time to run away. I wrote that he made the world feel less lonely. I wrote that loving him had made me braver, even if he never knew. I wrote that I was not asking him to change, or answer, or become someone he was not. I only needed the truth to exist somewhere outside my body, just once. When I finished, my hand ached, the candle was low, and the first pale light of morning had begun to press against the curtains. I folded the pages carefully, placed them in a blue envelope, and wrote his name on the front. For Mason, when I am brave enough. Then I put it inside the cover of the adventure novel he had been begging to borrow, because I was certain I would take it out before he ever saw it. I was wrong. The next morning arrived too bright, too ordinary, and completely unaware that I had placed my entire heart inside a library book. I woke up with the kind of panic that makes every sound too loud, my alarm clock, my mother rinsing coffee mugs downstairs, the neighbor mowing his lawn even though the grass was still damp from the storm. I told myself I would get to Mason before school, take the envelope out, laugh at my own stupidity, and spend the rest of senior year pretending nothing had happened. But Mason was already waiting by my locker when I arrived, holding the adventure novel against his chest like a trophy. He had mud on one sneaker, a paper bag from Daisy's diner in his hand, and that easy morning smile that always made my plans forget how to stand. "You brought it," he said, tapping the book. "Finally. I thought you were going to guard this thing forever." My mouth went dry. I could see the blue edge of the envelope tucked inside the front cover, thin as a secret and twice as dangerous. I reached for the book too quickly and said I might have left a sketch between the pages. Mason lifted it over his head, grinning because he thought we were playing. He was taller than me by 4 inches and unfairly proud of it. "Relax, Bennett. I will return your precious masterpiece in one piece." Before I could answer, Emily Parker appeared beside him with a pink binder hugged to her chest, asking if he was still coming to decorate the gym after practice. Mason turned toward her, and I watched his face soften in that polite, hopeful way that told me the dance was no longer just an idea. He said yes. Emily smiled. I smiled too, because some instincts are not brave, only well-trained. The bell rang, the hallway filled, and Mason slipped the book into his backpack. Just like that, the letter was gone. 4. The rest of the day, I moved through classes like a person underwater. In English, I underlined the same sentence 6 times. In art, I painted the sky the color of wet concrete. At lunch, Mason sat across from me and talked about how his father had agreed to lend him the truck for the dance, and I nodded as if every word was not pulling a thread loose inside me. I had several chances to ask for the book back. I could have told him the truth. I could have invented a lie. Instead, I watched him leave school with it under one arm, sunlight flashing off the windshield of his truck, and I understood that cowardice did not always look like running away. Sometimes it looked like staying exactly where you were and saying nothing. Graduation came 2 weeks later in the football field behind the high school, with folding chairs sinking into the grass and parents waving paper fans printed with the school mascot. Mason hugged me so hard my cap nearly fell off. He smelled like sunscreen, laundry soap, and the future. "Boston is only 3 hours away," he said, as if 3 hours were not a whole universe when you were 17. "You are not getting rid of me." I laughed and told him I expected regular proof of life, preferably with photos of terrible cafeteria food. He promised. I believed him because believing Mason had always been easier than surviving without him. That evening, after the parties and family photos and too much grocery store cake, he stopped by my house to return the book. I opened the cover the second he left, my hands shaking so badly the pages fluttered. The envelope was not there. For one impossible moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe grief had made me dramatic before anything had even happened. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Mason appeared on the screen. "Found something in the book. Did you want it back someday, or should I keep it safe until you are brave enough?" I stared at those words until they blurred. He knew there was a letter. He had seen my handwriting, but he had not opened it. Maybe that should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a frozen lake, hearing the ice shift beneath my feet. I typed 3 different replies and deleted them all. Finally, I sent, "Keep it safe." And Mason did. For 10 years, he did exactly that. 10 years sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, like a locked room in an old novel or a bridge that took generations to build, but living through it was mostly ordinary. It was laundry on Sundays, bills on the kitchen table, birthday texts sent at 11:57 at night, and whether small talk when the things we really wanted to ask felt too heavy for a phone screen. Mason went to Boston with 2 duffel bags, a used pickup truck, and a confidence that made the city seem less like a monster and more like a puzzle he intended to solve. I stayed in Briar Lake for community college, then art school online, then the kind of freelance work that paid in uneven waves. Wedding place cards in May, bookstore posters in October, custom Christmas portraits of golden retrievers wearing scarves in December. By 27, I had a studio above Daisy's Bakery, a cat named Waffles who judged my life choices from the windowsill, and a career that looked charming from the outside and terrifying from the inside. I drew invitations for couples who chose each other in public again and again, while I kept my oldest choice folded in silence somewhere 3 hours away. Mason kept his promise to send proof of life. At first, it was constant. A photo of the smallest dorm room in Massachusetts. A blurry picture of noodles he had burned in a microwave. A video of him standing proudly beside his first restored porch, explaining the wood grain like it was a miracle. I answered with sketches of the lake, bad coffee reviews, and pictures of Waffles sleeping on unpaid invoices. We were good at being almost fine. We were excellent at making distance look friendly. He dated Emily for 8 months during freshman year, then a woman named Lauren who studied architecture, then someone named Paige who owned too many plants and once mailed me a thank you card because Mason had told her I helped him pick out her birthday gift. I dated too, in careful, hopeful attempts that never lasted as long as the people deserved. There was Ben, who taught 3rd grade and had a laugh like a car refusing to start. There was Julian, who made incredible pasta and once asked, gently, whether I always looked toward the door because I was expecting someone else. I told him no. He was kind enough not to believe me. None of those relationships were failures, not exactly. They were small lessons in how much of myself I had placed in a room I refused to enter. Every year on my birthday, Mason called instead of texting. Every year, I almost asked about the letter. Every year, he did not mention it either. Sometimes I imagined he had lost it in a move, tucked it into a box of old receipts, or finally thrown it away while cleaning out a closet. Then one winter, when he came home for Christmas, I saw his wallet open on the counter at Daisy's Bakery while he paid for coffee. Behind his license was a corner of faded blue paper. My breath stopped for half a second. Mason noticed me noticing. His hand stilled. Then he closed the wallet without a word and asked if I still hated raisins and cinnamon rolls. I said yes, because it was safer than saying, "You still have it." He bought me the raisin-free one. That was Mason. He could carry a secret for a decade and still remember the smallest thing about breakfast. By the time he returned to Briar Lake for more than a holiday weekend, he was no longer the boy waving flashlights in a storm. He was a man with sawdust on his sleeves, careful eyes, and a dream of opening his own restoration studio. I was no longer the boy who hid behind sketchbooks. I had learned how to invoice clients, unclog a sink, disappoint people politely, and make a home out of a second-floor apartment that smelled like butter, sugar, and rain. We had both grown up. We had both changed. But when Mason called one chilly Monday morning in March and said he had accepted a 6-week project restoring the old greenhouse by the lake, my first thought was not practical or mature. It was simply this: he is coming home. The old greenhouse had belonged to the Whitmore family for almost a century, a glass and iron skeleton on the north edge of Lake Briar, where Clara Whitmore's grandmother once grew roses stubborn enough to bloom through Vermont frost. By the time Mason came back, half the panes were fogged, the floor was uneven, and the vines had claimed the back wall like they had been quietly waiting for permission. Clara wanted it restored into a small event space by June, which sounded romantic until she handed Mason a clipboard with 17 pages of requirements and told him the building needed to look enchanted, structurally safe, and emotionally expensive. Mason blinked at the list, then looked at me, because Clara had hired me to design the invitation suite, the welcome sign, the menus, the seating chart, and, somehow, the personality of the entire wedding season. I told him emotionally expensive was my specialty. He said he thought that was just what coffee cost now. That was how the 6 weeks began, not with thunder or confession, but with a folding table, 2 paper cups of coffee, and Mason arguing that ivory, cream, and champagne were the same color under different tax brackets. I told him that statement alone could get him banned from 3 bridal forums. He laughed, and for one dangerous second, the years between us folded like tissue paper. Working with him should have been difficult. Instead, it became familiar in the most unfair way. Mason arrived every morning at 7:30 with sawdust already on his jacket and a coffee for me from Daisy's Bakery, black with 1 splash of oat milk because I had switched from cream 2 years earlier and had no memory of telling him. I pretended not to notice. He pretended not to notice me pretending. I spread paper samples across the folding table while he measured beams, replaced cracked panes, and spoke to old wood with the patience of a man apologizing to it. The greenhouse changed slowly under his hands. The rusted doors began to swing without complaining. The broken shelves became smooth benches. The dull iron frame turned dark green after Clara insisted black was too severe and Mason asked if buildings could have moods. Clara said yes. I said especially old ones. He looked at me then, not amused exactly, but soft around the eyes, like he remembered a boy who once drew lonely trees behind the library. There were easy moments too, the kind that made the workdays feel like pages from a life I had not known I wanted. Mason cut his finger on a sheet of paper while trying to help me fold sample menus and looked personally betrayed by stationery. I put a bandage on it while he claimed the menu had attacked him. He built a wooden display board for my sketches without asking and pretended it was just because the folding table was too small. I brought him lunch after finding out he had been eating protein bars in his truck, and he acted like soup in a paper bowl was a luxury item. Once, when rain started suddenly and loudly, trapping us inside, he climbed onto a ladder to patch a leak while I stood below holding the flashlight. Water dripped onto his shoulder. He looked down and said, "This feels familiar." I said, "You still have poor roof management skills." He smiled so warmly that I had to look away. Around town, people noticed. Daisy put our coffees in the same cardboard carrier and wrote Team Greenhouse on the side. Clara kept scheduling meetings for both of us when she only needed one. Mrs. Alvarez from the flower shop asked whether Mason preferred eucalyptus or olive branches, then winked at me as if the greenery was not the real question. Mason always answered with practical seriousness, and I always rescued him before he accidentally approved something tragic. Still, beneath the laughter, there was a quiet ache neither of us named. Sometimes I caught him watching me when he thought I was focused on drawing. Sometimes his hand hovered near the inside pocket of his jacket, where I knew, with the certainty of an old wound, that the blue envelope still lived. And every time I saw that motion, I wondered if coming home meant he was finally ready to open more than an old building. By the 4th week, the entire town had decided Mason and I were the greenhouse project, and the actual greenhouse was only a charming side effect. Daisy started drawing tiny hearts in the foam of Mason's coffee, which would have been subtle if she had not leaned across the counter and asked whether I wanted my usual or his usual by mistake. Mrs. Alvarez sent over olive branches with a note that said, "For whatever is blooming," and Clara pinned it above her planning desk like evidence in a case she was determined to win. Even Waffles betrayed me by jumping into Mason's lap the first time he came upstairs to fix my loose window latch, purring with the smug confidence of a cat who had recognized a future source of treats. Mason handled all of it with the bewildered seriousness of a man trying to solve a math problem that kept turning into poetry. He thanked Daisy for the hearts. He asked Mrs. Alvarez if olive branches needed water. He told Waffles that he was honored by the promotion. I told him he was encouraging the wrong people. He said, "There are wrong people," and I nearly dropped a stack of place cards because there it was again, that careless warmth that made my chest feel like a room with all the windows open. The problem was that Mason noticed everything except the thing everyone else could see. He noticed when I skipped lunch and left a turkey sandwich on my drafting table with the pickles removed. He noticed when my wrist cramped from lettering 112 escort cards and quietly bought me a soft grip pen from the hardware store because the office supply store had closed early. He noticed that I always turned my mug so the chipped side faced away from clients. But when Clara asked him one afternoon, in the middle of a meeting about seating arrangements, Whether he and I had ever considered that maybe the universe was not being subtle, Mason looked genuinely startled. He laughed once, not unkindly, just reflexively, and said, "Noah and I are just friends." The words landed softly. That made them worse. There was no cruelty in his voice, no embarrassment, no rejection meant as rejection. He said it the way someone says the sky is blue or the lake is cold in April. True because it had always been true. Safe because nobody had challenged it. I was standing behind him with a tray of sample menus in my hands. Clara's eyes flicked to me, sharp and apologetic. Mason turned a second later and saw my face before I could arrange it into something harmless. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I smiled, because I had spent 10 years becoming very good at surviving that sentence. "He is right," I said, setting the menus on the table. "Besides, I have a strict policy against dating men who think champagne is beige." Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sigh. Mason smiled too, but his came late. After the meeting, I walked to the lakeshore with the excuse of checking the sign placement, though there was nothing to check except my own breathing. The wind was cold enough to sting my cheeks, and the water moved in small gray waves against the dock. I told myself I was not 17 anymore. I was not trapped in a treehouse with a secret too large to carry. I had built a life. I had clients, rent, a stubborn cat, and an unfinished picture book waiting on my desk. I deserved a love that did not need translation. Behind me, footsteps slowed on the gravel. Mason stopped a few feet away, close enough for warmth, far enough for mercy. "I hurt you," he said quietly. I looked at the lake because looking at him felt harder. "You told the truth as you understood it. That does not make it harmless." The answer surprised me. So did his voice, careful and shaken at the edges. I turned then. Mason had his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind, and for once he did not look like the man who could fix anything. He looked like someone finally realizing a house could be standing for years and still have a locked room inside. "Noah," he said, then stopped, as if my name had opened a door he was not ready to walk through. I waited, not hopefully, not hopelessly, just honestly. And when he did not finish, I nodded, gentle but tired, and walked back toward the greenhouse, leaving him by the lake with the silence he had kept safe for 10 years. For 3 days after the lake, Mason and I became painfully polite. We still worked in the same greenhouse, still drank the same coffee, still passed each other rolls of painter's tape and samples of vellum paper. But the easy rhythm between us had gone careful, like music played in a room where someone was sleeping. Clara watched us over the rim of her travel mug with the exhausted patience of a woman managing flowers, budgets, weather, and 2 grown men who apparently needed a written permit to feel anything. The storm that finally broke the silence came on a Thursday night, sudden and cold, rattling the glass panes with hard spring rain. I had stayed late to finish the seating chart because one of Clara's clients had changed her mind about 3 cousins, 2 ex-roommates, and an aunt who could not be seated within 20 feet of the dessert table. Mason stayed too, because one corner of the roof had started leaking directly onto the newly sanded floor. By 9 o'clock, the greenhouse was empty except for us, the smell of wet earth rising from the old planting beds, and the fairy lights glowing in warm loops above our heads. Mason climbed down from the ladder with rain in his hair and disappointment on his face, holding a wrench like it had personally failed him. "I fixed that seam yesterday," he said. "Maybe the roof is emotionally processing." I answered without looking up. He laughed once, quietly, and the sound loosened something in my chest. I reached for my pencil bag on the workbench, but my elbow knocked into Mason's open tool case. A small tin of screws tipped over, scattering across the floor. I crouched quickly, apologizing, and began gathering them before they rolled beneath the benches. That was when I saw the blue envelope tucked beneath a folded cloth beside his measuring tape. For a moment, the rain seemed to stop, though of course it did not. My fingers closed around one tiny screw, cold and silver against my palm. Mason saw where I was looking. He did not move to hide it. He only stood there, breathing slowly, his expression stripped of every joke, every easy defense, every safe version of himself. "You still bring it with you," I said. My voice was softer than I expected. Mason sat on the lowest rung of the ladder, elbows on his knees, eyes on the envelope. I tried leaving it in a drawer in Boston. Then I would drive halfway to a job and wonder if there was a fire or a flood or if I had imagined the whole thing. So I kept it with me. I wanted to be angry. Some part of me had earned that. But he looked so honest, so lost, that anger could not find a place to stand. Did keeping it hurt less than reading it? I asked. Mason closed his eyes. The question landed between us with the weight of 10 years. No, he said. It just let me stay the same. The rain tapped against the glass. A drop fell from the repaired seam into the bucket below with a quiet, hollow sound. Mason reached for the envelope but did not open it. Instead, he held it out to me with both hands, as carefully as if it were something alive. You can take it back, he said, if you want. I do not deserve to decide when your words get heard. I looked at the faded paper, at the handwriting of a boy who had been terrified and brave at the same time. Then I looked at Mason, the man who had finally stopped calling silence protection. No, I said. Read it. His eyes lifted to mine, startled and bright. Now, not to punish yourself, not to fix everything in one dramatic moment. Just read it because I am tired of being the only person in the room who knows what it says. Mason nodded. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. He unfolded the pages slowly, and as his eyes moved over the first line, his face changed. Not with shock, not with pity, with recognition, deep and quiet, like he had opened a door in a house he had lived in for years and found sunlight waiting inside. I did not ask what he felt. I did not need to. When he finished, he pressed the letter to his chest, bowed his head, and whispered, I think I have been coming home to you my whole life. I was just too afraid to call it that. 3 months after Mason opened the letter, the greenhouse stood finished at the edge of Lake Briar, no longer a skeleton of glass and rust, but a warm, living room made of sunlight, green iron, and old wood polished back to grace. Clara had cried the first time she saw it completed, then immediately stopped crying so she could tell the florist that the tulips were leaning too far left. Daisy baked lemon cupcakes with tiny sugar leaves on top. Mrs. Alvarez filled the aisle with white flowers and olive branches. Waffles was not invited because Mason said no wedding was strong enough to survive a cat with opinions, but Daisy promised to show him pictures later, which seemed to satisfy everyone except Waffles. The morning felt impossible in the gentlest way. I stood in the small back room of the greenhouse, buttoning my jacket with fingers that refused to behave, while Mason's father adjusted my boutonniere for the 3rd time and pretended his eyes were only watery because of pollen. My mother kept touching my sleeve as if she needed proof that I was really there, really happy, really about to walk into a future I had once believed belonged to other people. When the music began, I expected fear. Instead, I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes when life stops asking you to run. Mason was waiting beneath the oak arch he had built, the same arch from that first golden afternoon when he held my letter and brought the entire story back to the place where it was meant to begin. His hair had already escaped its careful styling. Of course it had. I smiled before I could stop myself, and he smiled back with such open relief that everyone else in the room disappeared for one bright second. Clara stood beside us as our officiant, because after surviving 6 weeks of our emotional incompetence, she said she had earned the right to make it legally meaningful. The ceremony was simple. No grand speeches about destiny, no dramatic promises too heavy for real life. Just 2 men in a greenhouse, with our families, our friends, and a lake shining beyond the glass. When it was time for vows, Mason reached into his jacket and took out the blue envelope. The room grew quiet, but this time I did not feel exposed. I felt seen. He did not read every word. Some things still belonged only to us. He read the line about the world feeling less lonely, and the line about bravery, and then he folded the paper with careful hands. His voice shook when he said, Noah, I spent years thinking love had to arrive with certainty, like a sign on a highway. But love was you saving me the last cinnamon roll, you drawing lonely trees, you laughing at my terrible roof repairs, you letting me grow into someone who could finally stand here and tell the truth. You were never my almost. You were my home before I knew what home meant. I had planned elegant vows. I had written 4 drafts and cried over 2 of them. In the end, I forgot nearly all of it. I told him that I loved the boy who built a crooked treehouse, the man who restored broken places without making them ashamed of their cracks, and the friend who had become brave enough to meet me on the other side of silence. Then I gave him a small handmade book instead of another speech. On the cover were two boys sitting in a treehouse under a stormy sky. Inside, they grew older, lost each other in different cities, found each other again beside a lake, and built a house with enough windows for every secret to become sunlight. Mason cried before page 7. Clara cried before page 3. Daisy claimed she only cried because the paper quality was beautiful. When Mason and I exchanged rings, the greenhouse filled with applause, laughter, and the soft sound of people who had been waiting for something good to happen. Later, after cupcakes and dancing and Mason proving once again that rhythm was not one of his gifts, we slipped away to the edge of the lake. The sunset turned the water gold, just like it had on the day he first read my words aloud. Mason took my hand, warm and steady, and for the first time in my life, love did not feel like a secret I had to survive. It felt like a place we had built together, one small honest choice at a time. Years later, we framed the blue envelope and hung it in my studio beside the first page of that picture book. People sometimes asked what it was. Mason always looked at me before answering, and I always let him say it because he said it best. That, he would tell them, smiling softly, is the letter that waited until we were ready.